Some promises don't fade with time. They wait until the world is finally ready to understand why they mattered. Sir, this entrance is for invited guests. I'm only here to repair the air conditioning. You'll have to use the service door. The words were polite, but the eyes weren't. Several guests in tailored suits turned to look at the man holding a worn toolbox. One of them smirked before whispering loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. They'll let anyone into a charity gala these days. A few people laughed. The man didn't. Ethan Carter simply lowered his eyes, adjusted the old leather strap of his toolbox, and thanked the security guard with a quiet nod before walking toward the back entrance. He had grown used to doors closing before he ever reached them. The autumn wind swept through the marble courtyard, carrying dried leaves across polished stone. Expensive cars lined the entrance beneath warm golden lights, while Ethan's aging pickup truck sat alone near the loading dock, its faded paint almost disappearing into the evening shadows. None of that bothered him. He had come because the building manager called. The ballroom's cooling system had failed only hours before the largest charity event of the year. People inside worried about comfort. Ethan worried about finishing before his daughter finished her evening shift at the neighborhood bookstore. That was the difference. He climbed a narrow metal staircase toward the maintenance floor. Every step echoed softly through the quiet corridors above the ballroom, where laughter, crystal glasses, and orchestral music blended into the sound of a world that had never known his name. 15 years earlier, rain had swallowed the highway. A small family sedan spun helplessly as floodwater crashed against the guardrail. People screamed. Cars stopped. No one moved. Except one man. Without asking who was inside. Without wondering whether he would survive, Ethan ran straight into the current. The freezing water reached his chest before anyone realized what he was doing. When firefighters finally arrived, they found Ethan carrying a terrified little girl wrapped inside his own jacket. She couldn't stop crying. She reached for his hand. Will I ever see you again? Ethan smiled despite the blood running down his forehead. You don't owe me anything. The little girl shook her head with surprising determination. I'll come back. He laughed softly, believing those were simply the frightened words of a child who had survived something impossible. Then the ambulance doors closed. Life moved on, or so he believed. Now, 15 years later, only one object still connected those two lives. Around Ethan's wrist rested an old silver watch with a cracked crystal. It no longer kept perfect time. He wore it anyway. No one inside the ballroom knew why. No one recognized the quiet maintenance worker climbing above their heads. And certainly no one could have imagined that somewhere beneath the glittering chandeliers stood the woman who had spent 15 years searching for the man wearing that broken watch. Tonight, one forgotten promise was about to silence an entire room. The maintenance room overlooked the grand ballroom through a narrow observation window that most people never noticed. Ethan carefully removed the front panel from the aging cooling unit and placed every screw inside a small metal tray. He worked with the same patience that had shaped every difficult year of his life. There was never any rush in his movements because rushing often meant making mistakes, and mistakes were expensive when you were raising a daughter alone. His hands carried tiny scars collected from years of honest work, yet every motion remained steady. Below him, crystal chandeliers shimmered above hundreds of elegantly dressed guests. Laughter drifted upward with the music, filling the space with warmth that felt distant rather than inviting. Ethan barely looked down. He tightened a loose connection, checked the air pressure, and quietly whispered to himself, almost finished. At that very moment, a black sedan rolled to the front entrance. Every camera turned toward the arriving guest. Security officers straightened their jackets. Event organizers rushed outside with welcoming smiles that had not existed a few minutes earlier. Charlotte Bennett stepped from the vehicle wearing a simple navy blue evening dress that carried far less attention than the respect people immediately showed her. She was one of the youngest chief executive officers in the country, but she had never enjoyed grand entrances. She thanked the driver, greeted every employee by name whenever she recognized them, and paused to shake hands with the volunteers standing near the doors. One elderly volunteer smiled nervously and apologized because the evening's schedule had fallen behind. Charlotte simply smiled back. Kindness always matters more than perfect timing. Those words sounded ordinary to everyone else. To her, they had become the foundation of an entire life. As she entered the ballroom, Applause echoed through the room. Investors admired her success. Reporters admired her achievements. Business leaders admired her discipline. None of them knew that Charlotte's attention was never fully on the stage. Every public appearance carried a private purpose. Every charity event offered another chance to continue a search that had lasted 15 years. She still remembered the frightened child she had once been. She still remembered the cold rain, the rushing water, and one calm voice telling her everything would be all right. She could no longer remember every detail of his face, but she remembered his eyes. Quiet eyes, gentle eyes, eyes that expected nothing in return. In her private office, inside the top drawer of an old wooden desk, rested a faded newspaper clipping that never appeared in interviews or magazine articles. The headline described an unidentified local man who rescued a little girl during severe flooding before leaving without speaking to reporters. The photograph was blurry. His face remained impossible to identify. Yet one detail had always stood out. A cracked silver watch rested around his wrist. Hundreds of investigators had searched for that man. Thousands of records had been reviewed. Every possible lead had disappeared. Until tonight. As Ethan finished repairing the cooling system, he wiped the dust from his hands with an old cloth and instinctively adjusted the cracked watch resting against his sleeve. Down below, Charlotte happened to glance upward toward the maintenance balcony for only a brief second. Her speech stopped in the middle of a sentence. Her breathing became still. Across the crowded ballroom, beneath layers of lights, music, and 15 years of silence, she had finally seen the watch she had never forgotten. Charlotte continued her speech as though nothing had happened, but her heart was no longer following the carefully prepared remarks displayed on the confidence monitor in front of the stage. Her eyes returned again and again to the narrow maintenance balcony above the ballroom. The man had already turned away and disappeared behind a heavy metal door, completely unaware that one brief movement had ended a search that had consumed nearly half her life. She finished thanking the donors, accepted the applause with a gracious smile, and stepped away from the podium. Around her, board members discussed investment plans, reporters requested interviews, and photographers asked for another picture. Charlotte answered each person politely, yet her thoughts remained fixed on a cracked silver watch resting on the wrist of a maintenance worker. Quietly, she leaned toward her executive assistant, Emily Harper. "Can you do something for me?" Emily nodded immediately. "Of course. Please find the technician who repaired the cooling system. I would like to thank him personally. Do not make an announcement. Do not let security embarrass him. Simply ask if he has a few minutes." Emily recognized the unusual tone in Charlotte's voice. This was not curiosity. This was something much deeper. She quietly left the ballroom and headed toward the service corridor. Upstairs, Ethan had already finished cleaning the work area. He believed that leaving a place cleaner than he found it was part of doing the job correctly. He packed every tool into its proper place before signing the maintenance report. The building manager approached with a grateful smile. "Excellent work, Ethan. You saved the evening." Ethan shrugged gently. "I only fixed what was broken." The manager laughed. "You always say that." Ethan smiled, but said nothing more. Before leaving, he checked his phone. There was one message from his daughter. "Hi, Dad. My shift ends at 8:30. Please do not wait outside. It is getting cold." Ethan answered immediately. "I will be there. I always am." He slipped the phone back into his pocket and started walking toward the employee exit. Halfway down the hallway, Emily caught up with him. "Excuse me, sir." Ethan stopped politely. "Yes, ma'am. Miss Charlotte Bennett would like to thank you for your work tonight, if you have a few moments." Ethan looked surprised. "The chief executive officer?" Emily smiled. "Yes." Ethan glanced at the old wall clock. He calculated the drive across town, the evening traffic, and the promise he had just made to Lily. He shook his head with quiet regret. "Please thank her for me, but my daughter is waiting. She has been waiting for me every evening since she was little, and I have never broken that promise." Emily could see complete sincerity in his eyes. There was no excitement about meeting a famous executive, no desire to impress anyone, only the calm certainty that one promise mattered more than another opportunity. "I understand," she replied softly. Ethan tipped his head with appreciation and continued toward the parking lot. From the ballroom windows, Charlotte happened to see the old pickup truck pulling away beneath the city lights. She did not know where he was going. She only knew one thing with absolute certainty. 15 years ago, He had walked away without asking for recognition. Tonight, he had walked away from the most powerful woman in the building for exactly the same reason that had once made him unforgettable. Someone he loved was waiting for him. Charlotte remained near the ballroom entrance long after the guests believed the evening had ended successfully. She accepted congratulations with the same graceful smile she always offered, yet her thoughts had already followed the old pickup truck disappearing into the city traffic. Emily quietly returned and stood beside her. "I am sorry. He had to leave." Charlotte looked toward the empty driveway instead of showing disappointment. "Did he say why?" Emily smiled gently. "His daughter was waiting for him. He said he has never broken a promise to her." Charlotte lowered her eyes for a brief moment. A warm memory surfaced through the silence. 15 years earlier, that same calm voice had promised a frightened little girl that everything would be all right. Some people kept promises because they had to. Ethan Carter kept promises because it was simply who he was. The following morning, sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Bennett Global Headquarters. Executives gathered around the conference table expecting another discussion about quarterly earnings and future acquisitions. Instead, Charlotte placed a thin maintenance report in the center of the table. Every executive looked confused. "I want to know everything about this contractor," she said calmly. One director immediately misunderstood her request. Was there a problem with his work? Charlotte answered without hesitation. No, there was excellence in his work. Another executive opened the report and quickly scanned the information. His name is Ethan Carter, independent heating and cooling technician. Small business. Local license. Nothing unusual. Charlotte nodded slowly. Keep reading. There was very little else to read. No awards. No social media presence. No expensive certifications proudly displayed. No newspaper interviews. Nothing that suggested an extraordinary life. It was almost as though Ethan had intentionally lived without asking the world to notice him. Charlotte quietly closed the folder. Sometimes the most important stories leave the fewest records. After the meeting ended, she asked Emily to arrange a visit without revealing her identity. No press. No photographers. No corporate gifts. I want to see how he lives when nobody important is watching. That afternoon, a modest neighborhood welcomed them with tree-lined streets, children riding bicycles, and front porches decorated with flower pots instead of luxury. Emily parked across from a small white house with faded blue shutters. The lawn was neatly trimmed. Wind chimes moved softly beneath the porch roof. Nothing appeared wealthy, but everything reflected care. Charlotte watched quietly from inside the car. A few minutes later, Ethan's pickup rolled into the driveway. Before he even opened his own door, he walked around to the passenger's side carrying 2 paper grocery bags. The front door opened before he reached the porch. A young woman with chestnut hair rushed outside carrying a backpack and smiled with unmistakable affection. "Hi, Dad." Ethan laughed softly. "Did you eat lunch?" "Yes." "Are you sure?" She smiled wider. "You ask me that every day." "Because I care every day." They carried the groceries inside together while talking about ordinary things that could barely be heard through the closed windows. There was no luxury, no dramatic moment, no audience, only quiet love expressed through familiar routines. Charlotte felt her eyes grow moist as she continued watching from a distance. The man who had once saved a frightened little girl had never stopped rescuing someone. He had simply devoted his entire life to saving one daughter a little more every single day. Charlotte asked Emily not to schedule another visit for several days. "If I appear too quickly, he will only see a chief executive officer. I want to understand the man before he understands who I am." Emily agreed, although she had never seen Charlotte invest so much emotion in someone she had only met for a few seconds. During the following week, Charlotte quietly adjusted her calendar. Instead of attending another executive luncheon, she visited the neighborhood where Ethan lived. She parked several houses away and remained inside her car, careful not to disturb the ordinary rhythm of his life. Every morning unfolded almost exactly the same way. Ethan prepared breakfast before sunrise. He packed Lily's lunch with handwritten notes that always ended the same way. "I believe in you." After she left for college classes, Ethan drove to service calls across the city, fixing furnaces, repairing air conditioning systems, and helping families who often apologized because they could not afford expensive repairs. More than once, Charlotte watched him quietly lower the final bill after hearing an elderly customer explain that she was living on a fixed retirement income. He never announced the discount. He simply smiled and said, "Everything should work fine now." The grateful customers believed they had received good luck. Charlotte knew they had received grace. One afternoon, she followed him to a neighborhood community center where a youth basketball program struggled with a broken heating unit. The director nervously explained that the budget had already been exhausted. Ethan listened patiently before opening his toolbox. 2 hours later, warm air filled the building again. The director asked how much the repair would cost. Ethan looked around as children laughed while chasing basketballs across the polished floor. He smiled gently. "Tell them to practice hard. That will be enough payment." He left before anyone could argue. Charlotte remained standing outside the building long after Ethan drove away. She suddenly remembered another sentence from 15 years earlier. As a frightened child wrapped inside his jacket, she had asked why he had risked everything for someone he did not know. Ethan had simply answered, "Because someone always matters to somebody." She had carried those words into adulthood without ever knowing whether the man himself still lived by them. Now she had her answer. Nothing about him had changed except the passing years. That evening, Charlotte returned to her office carrying more questions than reports. She opened the old wooden drawer and carefully unfolded the faded newspaper clipping once again. Beside it rested a small braided friendship bracelet made from blue and white thread. It was uneven, childish, and slightly worn with age. She had made it herself while recovering after the flood, hoping she could someday thank the man who had saved her. She had never found him, so the bracelet remained with her through high school, college, her first promotion, and eventually the day she became chief executive officer. Charlotte held it gently between her fingers before making a quiet decision. "He never asked the world to notice him," she whispered. "But before I keep my promise, I need to know whether he will accept help without believing it is charity." Emily looked at her with curiosity. Charlotte smiled softly. "The next time we meet, he cannot know who I really am." Not yet. The promise she had carried for 15 years was finally within reach. But Charlotte believed that the greatest truths always revealed themselves in silence before they were spoken aloud. 3 days later, Charlotte exchanged her tailored executive wardrobe for a simple sweater, blue jeans, and comfortable walking shoes. She left the company vehicle behind and borrowed Emily's compact sedan instead. There would be no security team, no photographers, and no announcement. If Ethan noticed her at all, she wanted him to see nothing more than another ordinary customer. Early that afternoon, she parked outside a neighborhood bookstore where Lily worked after her college classes. Through the front window, she watched Ethan carrying a cardboard box filled with repaired shelves. He was smiling while speaking with the store owner, an elderly gentleman named Mr. Harrison. When the work was finished, Mr. Harrison counted several bills before handing them to Ethan. Ethan accepted the payment, looked at the amount for a moment, then quietly returned 2 of the bills. "This is too much," he said. Mr. Harrison frowned. "You spent nearly 4 hours fixing everything." Ethan smiled. "Most of that time was spent talking with you. Friends should not charge friends for conversation." The old man laughed until his eyes became watery. Charlotte stood silently behind a nearby bookshelf pretending to browse through novels, but every word settled deeply in her heart. A few minutes later, Lily noticed Charlotte looking through the history section. "Can I help you find something?" she asked warmly. Charlotte returned the smile. "Actually, I am looking for a good book about people who quietly changed the lives of others." Lily thought for a second before walking toward another shelf. "My dad always says the best heroes usually never expect anyone to remember their names." Charlotte felt her heartbeat slow. "Your father sounds like a wise man." Lily laughed softly. "He would probably say he just makes a lot of mistakes and keeps learning from them." At that moment, Ethan walked into the bookstore carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate. He handed one to Lily before noticing Charlotte standing nearby. "I hope we are not interrupting you," he said politely. "Not at all," Charlotte answered. "Your daughter was helping me choose a book." Ethan nodded with genuine kindness. "She usually gives better advice than I do." Charlotte looked carefully at his face. Time had added gentle lines around his eyes, but the kindness she remembered had never disappeared. He still had no idea who she was. He simply saw another stranger deserving of courtesy. Before leaving, Charlotte selected a novel from the shelf. As she reached for her wallet, she realized she had intentionally left it inside the borrowed car. She smiled with quiet embarrassment. "I am sorry. It seems I forgot my purse." Without hesitation, Ethan placed a few bills on the counter. "Please let me help." Charlotte looked surprised. "You do not even know me." Ethan answered with the same calm voice that had once comforted a frightened little girl. "Everyone needs a little help once in a while." Charlotte accepted the book with trembling hands. "Then I promise I will return the favor." Ethan smiled gently. "Kindness is not a loan. You do not have to pay it back. Just pass it on to someone else when the day comes." As Charlotte walked toward the parking lot holding the book against her chest, she realized he had unknowingly repeated the lesson that had shaped her entire life. And for the first time in 15 years, keeping her promise no longer felt like a dream. It felt wonderfully close. Charlotte drove home without opening the book Ethan had purchased for her. It rested quietly on the passenger seat beside the small paper receipt that proved he had spent his own money on a complete stranger without expecting gratitude or recognition. More than once during the drive, she remembered his words. "Kindness is not a loan." She whispered the sentence aloud, letting the silence finish what her heart already understood. 15 years had changed his appearance, but they had not changed his character. The following Monday, Bennett Global announced a new community partnership supporting technical education and skilled trade apprenticeships throughout the city. The project had existed only as an idea until Charlotte personally approved the funding over the weekend. Her board members praised the decision as a wise investment in the local workforce. Only Charlotte knew there was another reason behind it. She believed that people like Ethan had quietly built countless neighborhoods without ever receiving the respect they deserved. Across town, Ethan received an unexpected phone call from the director of the community center where he had repaired the heating system without charge. "Good news," the director said with excitement. "A new foundation has donated enough money to renovate the entire building. They specifically requested that local independent contractors receive the first opportunity to bid on the work. Would you be interested?" Ethan smiled with quiet gratitude. "I would be honored." He never asked where the funding came from. He simply thanked the director and returned to repairing an old furnace before driving to his next appointment. That evening, Lily came home carrying an envelope from her college. "Dad, I think there has been a mistake." Ethan looked up from preparing dinner. "What happened?" Lily handed him the letter with uncertain hands. It informed her that an anonymous educational foundation had awarded her a scholarship covering the remainder of her tuition because of her academic performance, volunteer service, and commitment to the community. Ethan read every line twice before smiling proudly. "You earned this." Lily shook her head. "But I never applied." Ethan gently folded the letter and handed it back. Sometimes life surprises good people. Neither of them imagined that Charlotte had personally removed every identifying detail from Lily's application before presenting it to the scholarship committee. She wanted the decision to be based entirely on merit, not on sympathy or gratitude. A week later, Charlotte returned to the bookstore, this time carrying the novel Ethan had purchased. When he happened to stop by after another service call, she approached him with a warm smile. "I finally finished the book." Ethan looked pleasantly surprised. "Did you enjoy it?" "Very much. Especially because someone else helped me discover it." She offered the book back along with the exact amount he had spent. Ethan accepted the novel but quietly pushed the money back toward her. "Then buy another book for someone who cannot afford one." Charlotte laughed softly. "You really make it difficult for people to repay you." Ethan shrugged with an easy smile. "Maybe that is because I was never looking to be repaid." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. The world admired powerful people because of what they owned. She was beginning to admire Ethan because of everything he quietly gave away. And although he still did not recognize the little girl whose life he had once changed forever, Charlotte knew the day of truth was drawing closer with every ordinary conversation they shared. Autumn slowly gave way to early winter, and what had begun as a chance meeting quietly became a familiar rhythm. Charlotte visited the bookstore whenever her schedule allowed, never announcing who she truly was and never allowing anyone from her company to accompany her. To Ethan, she was simply a thoughtful woman who loved books, asked sincere questions, and treated every employee with respect. To Charlotte, every conversation revealed another reason why she had never stopped searching for him. One afternoon she arrived just as Ethan was replacing a broken light fixture above the reading corner. The store owner apologized for interrupting his lunch break, but Ethan simply smiled. Children should never lose a place where they can read after school. Charlotte watched him finish the repair before quietly sitting nearby with a novel in her hands. When Ethan climbed down from the ladder, she asked, "Have you ever wished your life had turned out differently?" Ethan thought for a moment before answering. "Everyone wonders about different roads now and then." "And you?" she asked softly. He looked through the front window where Lily was helping a young boy choose his first chapter book. A peaceful smile appeared on his face. "If changing my past meant losing even one ordinary day with my daughter, I would not change a single thing." Charlotte lowered her eyes, hiding the emotion that threatened to reach the surface. Success had given her private jets, executive offices, and international recognition. Yet the greatest peace she had witnessed all year lived inside a man whose greatest treasure was an ordinary afternoon with his child. A few days later, Bennett Global announced its annual Community Legacy Celebration, an event honoring people whose quiet service had transformed lives without seeking recognition. Newspapers covered the announcement, expecting decorated veterans, famous philanthropists, or longtime civic leaders to receive the highest award. Charlotte reviewed every nomination herself before calmly placing one final name at the top of the list. Ethan Carter. Emily looked at the document with surprise. He has never held public office. He has never accepted awards. Most people attending the ceremony will not even know who he is. Charlotte smiled gently. That is exactly why he belongs there. Emily hesitated before asking the question she had carried for weeks. Will you finally tell him the truth? Charlotte reached into her desk drawer and carefully lifted the small blue and white friendship bracelet she had protected for 15 years. Time had faded its colors, but not its meaning. Yes, she whispered. Promises are not meant to live forever inside a drawer. 2 days later, an elegant invitation arrived in Ethan's mailbox. He assumed there had been some mistake. Why would someone invite an independent repair technician to a formal celebration hosted by one of the country's largest companies? Lily read the letter twice before smiling. Dad, maybe someone noticed all the people you have helped. Ethan laughed quietly and folded the invitation. I have never done anything worth standing on a stage. Lily looked directly into his eyes. Maybe that is exactly what makes you worthy. Ethan did not answer. He simply placed the invitation beside the old silver watch before preparing dinner, never imagining that the ceremony was not meant to honor the work of a repair technician. It had been prepared to fulfill a promise made by a frightened little girl who had waited 15 long years for one quiet moment to finally say thank you. The evening of the Community Legacy Celebration arrived beneath a clear winter sky filled with quiet stars. Ethan almost decided not to attend. He stood in front of the mirror wearing the only dark suit he owned, one he had purchased years earlier for a church wedding. Lily carefully adjusted his tie before stepping back with a proud smile. You look handsome, Dad. Ethan laughed softly. I look like a repair technician wearing a borrowed jacket. Lily shook her head. No, you look like the man who taught me that character always fits better than expensive clothes. They arrived at the grand ballroom together, and Ethan immediately fell out of place among business leaders, elected officials, and community philanthropists. He politely greeted everyone who smiled at him and quietly thanked the volunteers serving dinner, treating every person with the same respect regardless of their title. Across the room, Charlotte watched him with peaceful eyes. Even surrounded by wealth and influence, nothing about Ethan had changed. When the ceremony began, the master of ceremonies welcomed the guests before inviting Charlotte Bennett to the stage. The applause filled the ballroom, but Charlotte remained silent until every sound slowly disappeared. She looked across the audience before speaking with a calm voice. Tonight is not about celebrating success. It is about honoring a life that quietly changed another life without asking for recognition. A large screen behind her displayed an old newspaper clipping from 15 years earlier. The blurred photograph appeared exactly as Ethan remembered. His expression slowly changed as forgotten memories returned. Charlotte continued, her voice becoming softer with every sentence. 15 years ago, during a terrible storm, a little girl believed her life was ending. Then a stranger ran toward her while everyone else stood still. He wrapped her in his own jacket, carried her to safety, smiled, and disappeared before anyone could learn his name. The ballroom became completely silent. Charlotte reached into her pocket and gently lifted a small blue and white friendship bracelet. That little girl promised she would come back one day. Tears quietly gathered in Ethan's eyes as Charlotte slowly walked down from the stage until she stood only a few feet away from him. "Mr. Ethan Carter," she whispered, "you told me that I did not owe you anything. You were wrong." She carefully placed the bracelet into his trembling hands. "I never forgot your kindness. I never forgot your watch. I never forgot your voice. And I never forgot my promise." Ethan looked from the bracelet to Charlotte before recognition finally filled his eyes. "Charlotte." She nodded through quiet tears. "I came back." For several long moments, neither of them spoke. The entire ballroom watched in complete silence as Ethan gently smiled, the same gentle smile that had comforted a frightened little girl 15 years before. "You kept your promise," he said. Charlotte shook her head. "No, you kept yours first. You told me everything would be all right. You gave me a future. I only spent 15 years trying to find the man who made that future possible." The audience rose together in a standing ovation, but Ethan barely noticed. He had never wanted applause. He had never expected recognition. He had only chosen kindness because it was the right thing to do. Charlotte then turned toward Lily and invited both father and daughter onto the stage, announcing that the Community Legacy Foundation would establish the Ethan Carter Scholarship, supporting students who chose lives of service, integrity, and compassion. Ethan accepted the honor with quiet humility before looking across the room and saying the words that had guided his entire life. Kindness is never wasted. Even when nobody remembers your name, somebody remembers your heart. Once again, the ballroom fell into complete silence because everyone finally understood that the greatest heroes are rarely the loudest voices in the room. They are the quiet souls whose dignity changes lives long before the world ever learns their story.